Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor. And it's Wednesday. That means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I'll talk about a certain comic book graphic novel or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue on his channel will talk about that same comic book graphic novel or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team-up that we do once a week. And it is Garbogust, CriminOlly's reading event Garbogust, where he celebrates and we celebrate reading trashy fiction. And so all my Epic Comic Book Wednesdays this month in August are going to be trashy Marvel comics. Last week we did The Punisher, and this week, Ghostwriter. Yes, Ghostwriter. This is Ghostwriter Hell on Wheels, the Ghostwriter Epic Collection Volume 1, which has stories from 1972 to 1975. Early Ghostwriter. This is the early stuff with Johnny Blaze as Ghostwriter. There have been a few Ghostwriters, but Johnny Blaze was the great original Ghostwriter. Now, I hadn't read Ghostwriter since I was a kid. And I had never, as it turned out, read the first few stories that appeared in Marvel Spotlight, 5 through 12. I had never read those stories because I guess I was never able to find back issues of those when I was a kid. I read a fair share of Ghostwriter, but it was pretty spotty. You know, there were no collections back when I was a kid, and I was getting all of these comics secondhand. Because when this came out in 1972, the first Ghostwriter issue, I was 1 year old. I was 1 year old. And it's a little young for Ghostwriter. Not much, but a little. So, Ghostwriter, we've got stories in here by, was it Gary Friedrich? I think it's, yeah, Gary Friedrich and Tony Isabella, with Roy Thomas, Marv Wolfman, Doug Mensch, and Len Wein. Pencilers, we've got Mike Ploog, Tom Sutton, Jim Moody, Herb Trimpe, Sal Buscema, and Ross Andrews. So there are a lot of creators on this book. So like I said, I had never read any of these early Ghostwriter stories, and they are something. Let me just say that right off the bat. These early stories. So Ghostwriter did not premiere in his own book. He premiered in Marvel Spotlight, Ghostwriter number 5. There was a character, a Western character, who came out before this character did, who was called Ghostwriter. He was just like a Western vigilante. This is the supernatural Ghostwriter, and he is the most supernatural superhero of all. If you read the bottom of this cover to the original Ghostwriter story, it is a bit supernatural. This came out in the early 70s when everybody was obsessed with Satan because of The Exorcist and all kinds of other stuff that was, you know, floating around in horror fiction at the time. So Marvel Comics doesn't like to let that kind of thing slide by, so they thought they would take advantage of that kind of story to make the Ghostwriter. Now, reading this, I was like, how did the Ghostwriter survive these initial issues? Because they are ridiculous. The origin story is ridiculous. The original few stories are just so cheesy and silly. How did Ghostwriter survive this? I think one of the reasons is that he looks just so damn cool. And this is a character, even at the beginning, that had potential. You could do something with Ghostwriter. They were mostly doing terrible things in the original issues of Ghostwriter, but this is a character that you could do something with. And eventually, apparently, they did. But initially, the story... Let me just talk about the origin story, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So this is the Ghostwriter. He's already Ghostwriter when he shows up initially. His powers, his superpowers, are super vague. Basically, all we know at this point is that he's a guy that rides around. He has a skull for a head that's on fire. Well, that could be enough, but it's not. he runs afoul of some criminals, and one of his powers seems to be he can shoot flame out of his fingers or just cause flame to burst here and there. That is his superpower initially. Later on, he's got other stuff going on, and other superpowers eventually show up. But in the beginning, poor Johnny Blaze, there's poor Johnny Blaze, the cursed Johnny Blaze. In the beginning, he doesn't have much going on other than that. These initial issues were illustrated by Mike Ploog. Mike Ploog, Marvel Comics' go-to guy for 1970s horror comics. I like Mike Ploog a lot. And nobody can draw 1970s hair like Mike Ploog could. This guy had 1970s hair down. As well as just a basic 1970s look to everything, Mike Ploog. And he had kind of a cartoony style. He couldn't do superheroes. He just wasn't that type of artist. But he was really good for the kind of over-the-top, schlocky horror comics that Marvel was doing at the time. He was perfect for that. And so he was on Werewolf by Night, where he did magnificent work. He was on the Frankenstein comic book, where he was great. His masterpiece was the work he did on the Planet of the Apes black and white magazine. He did a series called Terror on the Planet of the Apes, I believe. And it was his best work probably ever. That was magnificent. This is pretty good, but it's also a little awkward at times. And the story itself, now the initial story is written by Gary Friedrich. Like, there are things about it, like, right away. There's that initial scene with the mysterious Ghostwriter who is Johnny Blaze. It's not a separate... It doesn't have a separate consciousness at this point. It's basically Johnny Blaze looking like the Ghostwriter with whatever a Ghostwriter's powers are. And so basically he's just that character. But there are things about this comic, like there's this scene. Johnny Blaze is an orphan and he's being raised by this family, the Crash Simpson and his family. This is Crash Simpson there. Crash Simpson is a daredevil motorcycle rider. He does stunts and they put on shows. So there is an accident and the woman who, Crash Simpson's wife, is killed, and she was kind of a mother figure to Johnny Blaze. Now on her deathbed, she makes him promise, she has a deathbed promise that he will not take part in any stunts anymore because she wants him to be safe or something. Now this is startling, this scene, because only like I think a few months earlier in Werewolf by Night, the Werewolf by Night, after he became a werewolf, his mother was tragically injured in an accident and was dying, and made that character do a deathbed promise, and the scenes were almost identical. I mean, you look at those two scenes and they're like, I just saw this in that Werewolf by Night character. So it must have been weird when this came out, because it was weird for me to read it and be like, wait, I read this before. I saw these very panels in that Werewolf by Night comic. That's odd. Anyway, I will move on. So Johnny Blaze can't take part in any of these exciting stunts. Look at that. That is just so cool. I love Ploog. He's so over the top and melodramatic, which is pretty much what this comic book is. And so this is Crash Simpson's daughter, who Johnny Blaze is in love with, but she thinks he's a coward because he won't do any stunts, even though her mother basically made him promise not to do stunts. It's like, well, why is this such a big deal? Apparently it is. And so they're both being real jerks to Johnny Blaze. And so he's got a problem. How will he, you know, fix this domestic situation? Satan! And this part was just, I'm like, what? Listen to this. Satan, yes, this is the only way. And even though I'm afraid, I mean, why is Satan the only way out of your problems? This seems, I mean, this really seems out of left field. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, Johnny Blaze is calling on Satan, and he's doing this satanic ritual to call the devil to help him out with his domestic difficulties. And of course, Satan shows up because this is a, you know, a Marvel horror comic. Mike Ploog has a pretty cool version of Satan there. Eventually, apparently, we learned that this isn't really Satan, it's just Mephisto from Marvel Comics pretending to be Satan. But before that retcon happened, obviously this was supposed to be Satan. Mike Ploog has a better version of Satan than Satan later on. This Satan, at least, you know, is kind of a shadowy figure. He's an over-the-top comic book villain, but, you know, Ploog was kind of trying to keep him in the shadows. But Ploog, he couldn't stand, I guess he couldn't take Ghostwriter for very long because he only lasted a few issues on Ghostwriter. He got Ghostwriter started, and eventually he moved on, and other artists moved in. But in these initial Ghostwriter comics, the plots are ridiculous. His powers are only slowly kind of... It's like when they started, they had a character that looked really cool, but they're like, well, what do we do with him, and what are his powers? I don't know. We'll just make it up as we go along. Which is, you know, pretty much what they did with Ghostwriter. And eventually, Crash Simpson dies in a crash. How about that? And he is used as Satan's tool to fight Johnny Blaze. He agrees to it so he can live again. Boy, some father figure he is. And right at that moment, Mike Ploog is just about to leave, and he starts getting inked by Jim Mooney, and the artwork becomes kind of terrible. And we have this big battle that takes place in hell, and that's kind of cool. We've got hell showing up here. But weirdly enough, that's only half of this issue. What issue is this? This is issue number 8. So we have half an issue that wraps up a storyline. And then, okay, that's all over. That's all done. It's all taken care of. We beat Satan. Oh, we still have half an issue left. What do we do with the other half of the issue? I don't know. Maybe we'll go out into the desert and run into a terrible Native American stereotype character. And they do. Yeah. So they start having adventures with this next villain, who is a Native American stereotype. They don't use the words Native American, they just call them Indians. What kind of Native Americans? Who are they? We don't know. We don't know who they are. They're just Indians. And, you know, at least they're not depicted as savages. Oh, darn it. So, yeah, so we've got that going on. But one really cool thing is that, you know, he turns into a giant snake and fights Johnny Blaze, and Johnny Blaze goes over a cliff by the end of this issue. That's kind of cool, but gosh darn it, as it turns out, Johnny Blaze is incredibly hard to kill. That's another power that showed up. He's incredibly hard to kill. You just can't kill him when he's Ghostwriter, at least for a while. That might have changed. But anyway, this book goes through a period of very awkward stereotypes and stories. And who is the next artist on this book? The next artist was Tom Sutton, who I don't feel was very good in these initial issues that he does. Everything looks a little peculiar. There's our stereotypical villain again. At the nearby Indian reservation. Which reservation? Who knows? It's just the nearby Indian reservation. And, you know, he calls everybody white eyes and things like that. And, yeah, so he's still fighting that guy. Eventually, he gets that wrapped up, and he meets... Doesn't he meet Satan's son? He does, eventually. He meets Hellstrom. Hellstrom shows up in here somewhere. Oh, yeah, here he is. There's the Son of Satan. The Son of Satan probably has the greatest 1970s outfit of all, where he's got the pentagram just on his chest and the pointy hair. He doesn't have horns. He just has pointy hair, and he's got his little pitchfork. You know, it's cool. Around this time, Johnny Blaze learns that he can make his own motorcycle out of Johnny Blaze Ghostwriter magic. We have more adventures, and these stories are, well, they're not good, frankly, but they are, I was entertained. I have to say, I was entertained by these early Ghostwriter stories. I loved the frequent appearances by Satan, who, like I said, is later retconned, and we find out that he's really Mephisto in this terrible Satan suit. Let's see if I could find a really good. Yeah, here we go. Every time I pull this out, I show this. But look at Satan. He's just so cheesy. It's just like the cheesiest version of the devil you can possibly have. It's Satan himself. And like he hangs around in hell with his demons, watching Johnny Blaze in his, you know, floating crystal ball, because, you know, that's what magic demons do. And turns out Crash Simpson is still wallowing in hell. That's unfortunate. You know, yeah, so we've got that going on. Eventually Jim Mooney takes over as the artist. We've got other really cheesy horror characters. And probably the best part of all is when Jesus makes a guest appearance. What you say? Jesus shows up in this comic book? Well, he's not identified as Jesus. Ever, I don't think. But look at him. He's just, this guy just wanders in his modern day, you know, 1970s outfit. Obviously Jesus, and Satan's like, damn it, it's Jesus. Man, you're ruining all my plans, dude. And Jesus helps up Johnny Blaze, and he's like, you know, let me help you up, Johnny. Blaze's soul is beyond you, Satan. He has earned his second chance. And the devil's like all pissed off, and he's like, the mortal has not yet seen the end of this. I promise you that. And, you know, Jesus is like, you know, So Jesus shows up and saves Johnny Blaze. Man, that's pretty lucky. He only identifies himself as a friend. And I think he shows up, Jesus shows up again later, but he's not allowed to be identified as Jesus, you know, for obvious reasons. And then Ghostwriter fights the Hulk. And that pretty much wraps up this issue, which is this John Buscema who does this issue? I want to say, it's Sal, excuse me, I knew it was Sal Buscema. It's Sal Buscema who does this issue. Sal Buscema, who does an okay Ghostwriter and a really good Hulk, but he is really rushed in this issue, you can tell. But yeah, this issue is wrapped up where he's fighting the Hulk. Everybody in the 70s had to run up against the Hulk at some point. So anyway, that was Ghostwriter. Now, I have it on good authority that Ghostwriter gets a lot better from here. I remember really liking Ghostwriter when I was a kid, but you know, I was 10. So I was probably 9 or 10 when I was reading Ghostwriter. Yeah, that feels about right. So maybe my judgment wasn't the best, but I do hear Ghostwriter gets better, and I am certainly going to keep following Ghostwriter as these epic collections are printed. Now, judging for how long it takes them to print some of these epic collection series, I figure by the time I'm 75 or 80, you know, I will have read a few of these Ghostwriter epic collections. This one was, like I said, the stories are pretty much terrible, but they're fun. They are 1970s horror comic book fun. Certainly not the best 1970s horror comic books. These aren't even close to being as cool as a lot of the cooler ones, I think. But the character of Ghostwriter, like I said, look how cool he looks. And like I said, I think that's what saved him. And I think that's what sold his comic. He was just such a cool character. He was a cool looking character with a lot of potential, which apparently eventually he reached. We'll see. Okay, guys, I'll shut up now. I've gone on long enough about the Ghostwriter. Check out Steve Donoghue on his channel when he talks about how terrible this is, and I We'll catch you next time.